Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality, and welcome to our webinar, Artificial Intelligence and Organizational Development. There's been an explosion of interest and an explosion of investment in artificial intelligence in the recent past, specifically over the last couple of years. And in some respects, the explosion is sort of creating conditions where being in the area of artificial intelligence for consulting companies, human resource consulting companies, are going to become table stakes in terms of everybody's going to have it, and then there'll be more of a question as to whether or not artificial intelligence will become a differentiator. In other words, if everybody has it, you have to have it just to participate in the field. But what we want to cover today is, what does the future hold for artificial intelligence, and what are some of the pitfalls, including are we building our human biases into these algorithms and systems that we're developing, and what do we need to avoid along the way? So our speaker today is Dr. Victoria Hendrickson, and this presentation is really a enhancement of an invited address. She was invited to present by Salesforce at their Dreamforce conference. If you've never heard of Dreamforce or familiar with it, it's about a 100,000 person conference that's held annually in San Francisco. So we were very honored to have been invited to present there. And she did a terrific job there. I unfortunately wasn't able to attend, but I heard they were hanging from the rafters in order to hear what Victoria had to say about this topic. So Victoria is a partner in the company at OV. She's a PhD in organizational psychology. She does a lot of different research. You may have heard about some of her work that we do and that she has done on comment analysis in employee surveys, but she's also doing work around inclusion and innovation. She's presented her findings at a lot of different conferences. And she actually has a book on how to do comment analysis that will be coming out early next year. And we're all looking forward to that. So let's get right to it. Time is short. By the way, just a couple of logistics kind of things. We will take your questions. If you have them, pop them in there and I'll do my best to monitor it. If we don't have time to answer your questions, Victoria would be happy to call you back and discuss things one-on-one. There will be a short survey at the end. This is a new format, a new length of survey, or a new length of webinar for us. And so we're interested in some feedback about too short, too long, time of day, all that kind of thing. So, but for now, let's get right to it so we don't run out of time. Victoria, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks everyone for signing on. I'm really glad to have you all here. This is an exciting topic. I really love chatting with everyone about this. I think it's an important topic. A lot of you on the phone are really friendly faces that we know well, and I know a lot of you are really familiar with this topic and have probably different perspectives that you're coming with. So in the next 25 minutes or so, we're not going to be able to solve world hunger here. We're probably not going to touch on every AI consideration that comes up across this group. But the goal here is really to lay out a frame for how we think about this, how we talk about it in the OE space, and really start the dialogue. I think there's obviously a lot more to come. The slide in front of you that I want to start with here, these are all real headlines, and I got to say they weren't hard to find. This is everywhere. There are stories about how AI is changing the world, whether it's you just as a person out there in the world and the way experiences are cultivated for you based on passive data, whether it's you as a customer and the kinds of things that different organizations are trying to cultivate for you, or really if it's you as an employee and the way your data is used. The headlines here are that AI is changing everything, and it is. There's no sense in denying that or trying to slow it down. Possibilities are really exciting, but the danger is that a lot of us don't know how it works. Jeff alluded to the presentation at Dreamforce. Dreamforce is a conference full of tech people, full of organizations that are using AI approaches in how they use really customer and employee data. And in the middle of the presentation, I asked a room full of people by a show of hands who thought AI could make better, more objective decisions than people. And, no surprise, they all raised their hands. That's exactly what I expected. The follow-up was, all right, keep your hand up if you really understand how it works. And I expected the hands to go down, but what I didn't expect is that 0 hands stayed up at a tech conference of customers of this kind of product. So, I think that says a lot. We're in a really telling time where there are big possibilities, but we need to be careful of how we dive in these beginning phases. So the goal is today is to look at what AI can do for us, where it is going to be a value added fit, and where there are some potential pitfalls we want to avoid. So, specific to our org effectiveness kinds of work and probably a lot of the trends that all of you are grappling with, the trends are really clear. Machine learning is everywhere. I do think a lot of people use the terms machine learning and AI interchangeably when there is some nuance. So when we talk about AI, we're talking about a broader concept of machines being able to carry out tasks in a way that we would consider smart. So, that's a lot of how can the machines cut down the work? How can they do what we're already have a vision of doing in a more efficient way? Whereas machine learning is a little more nuanced. It's an application within AI with the assumption that we can give machines access to different data points and let them learn for themselves. Let them come up with the relationships with the answers. And there are a lot of opportunities to do this in our kind of work. I would say the main 3 places we're seeing this in the market are around action planning. So, how to tell managers what to do with their results in a smart and data-based way. Also in comment analysis, so how we're going to find relationships across big volumes of unstructured data. And then, of course, in big data applications that are really going to harness disparate data points to find meaningful relationships. And those are all really compelling. Those all sound like great things we want to do. And it's easy to get carried away by these kinds of promises. I was talking to one head of OD who felt he was under a lot of pressure to use machine learning in his surveys and to do it quickly. I guess his CEO came to him and said, hey, we make AI. It's one of our products and we use it with our customer data. It gives us great success. So why aren't you using it for our people data? Couldn't you do a better job if you used our kind of technology on your people data? And that's really hard to argue with and say no to. It is a really compelling statement. But when we compare what our people data has and the kinds of implications against the way we use our customer data and those implications, there are a lot of differences. And that's going to take us to some of the dangers that we want to highlight today and the pitfalls we want to avoid. So, stepping back for a second, Jeff again talked about how Salesforce asked us to come and speak at Dreamforce with them. And they had a really specific ask around speaking about the dangers in how AI can work against inclusion and diversity kinds of values. How can biases within AI work against the kinds of things you're trying to build? And I think that's really symbolic. Salesforce has a huge public commitment to inclusion and diversity. They also have a whole lot of cool stuff in this space in development. But they recognize that these developments don't come without risk. I was talking to one of their designers, and he's been in this space a really long time. He's very good at what he does, but he told me he's worried about what's coming and how his work gets used with people data. The point he made is that when machine learning is used with customers, it's a really low-risk, high-reward situation. If you get things right, you get a flawless customer experience. But if you get things wrong and you make a bad call in designing your systems, or if you use some data that isn't completely clean, your customer might spend a couple of extra seconds on your website. Not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. But it's so different with your employee data. Get it wrong and you're going to mess with somebody's future, whether it's promotional opportunities, whether it's they get on the list for some new career development opportunity, whether it's compensation or something else. It's someone's work and it's someone's future. It's really personal. And so one of the main things I'm going to talk about today is bias. One of the main ways to get it wrong with people data is to use bad data, or more specifically, to use biased data. There are, certainly other pitfalls to avoid, but this is, one place we're going to focus, talk about the dangers of bias in machine learning, and then we'll step away, look at some broad implications for how to use AI and OE kind of work, and then some examples of how we can harness this potential specific to survey work. So, going to get started specifically with this section on bias and how it ends up in technology. Now, in the other talk, spent a whole long time here, but I know a lot of you on the phone are very experienced psychologists and analysts, so I'm really not going to harp on the background of bias too much here. The point is really to recognize bias. We all have biases. We use stereotypes every day. All of you on the phone know that stereotypes don't make you a good or bad person. They just are a cognitive pattern, a shortcut that's being human and helps you get through the day. So really the to-do is not to minimize a bias you have, but to recognize them and take steps to minimize the way you act on them or the way they impact the workplace. And so the image here we've got is to point out some of the differences between stereotypes and biases. The red sign's got no text, but I think if we all drove up to it, we would stop. It's a stereotype. It's a fixed and oversimplified idea. A bias, we're going to get into a little more nuance, so that's a little bit more of a prejudgment against one thing compared to another. It holds a little bit more of an evaluation than a description. So which is the better path to take, or what does that cop car behind us mean? Those are fairly free, but more recently in the news, something like men make better engineers than women do because they're more rational and less emotional. That is certainly a bias. It's certainly based on a prejudice that's not based in data, and it's one that's unfairly held against a group of people. So that's an easy one to keep in mind. And that's an example that is consciously held and distributed, pretty publicly. But for the most part, in most of our workplaces, biases tend to be unconscious. So we don't realize that we assume the youngest person in the room is the most junior, but we might base our behaviors and interactions from that assumption. And since these kinds of biases are unconscious, we don't talk about them in the same way. They fly under the radar, and that can make them pretty dangerous. And these are the kinds of things that can end up in our technology systems that we depend on in some different ways. So, what does the bias and the cop car here have to do with AI? This is all about how machine learning works and how we use those findings to move forward. So, as we're becoming more dependent on AI and machine learning specifically, we really need to understand the way it works so that we can make conscious decisions about how we train these systems and the kinds of decisions we use them for. So, a lot of us are familiar with the basic tenets of machine learning. Works really well when you give it a complex database with many different data points, and really you set it free. You allow it to learn from the patterns of the data and the different patterns that already exist in segments. So an easy example is in recruiting systems. You might feed it resumes, other candidate information, and a success profile of someone who's done really well in the job you're recruiting for. Then the machine learns from past decisions and uses available data to create an algorithm that will identify cases that are going to fit the end goal and give you, who are your top candidates for success in this position. The value there is that the machine learning is going to take all of these disparate data points and identify relationships that we wouldn't necessarily know to look for. Often we get really stuck in specific patterns that we look for in a particular job type. In this example, the machine learning might help us bust out of those preconceived patterns and identify your potential rock star candidates that don't fit that historical pattern but could do really well. And in that sense, the machine can give us a much better diversity of experience. The danger, though, is that we're training that machine to learn based on inherently biased decisions. So our past decisions of success are our criterion, and our past decisions of success haven't always been inclusive. So if we're feeding the machine biased data to learn from, it's going to give us biased models. If we provide limited data, it can only learn from that data, and ultimately it's going to be sub-optimized. A simple survey example is, look, if you've got a survey that's all about engagement, It's going to tell you plenty about engagement, but it's not going to tell you anything about customer service or safety. So, the point here is that our programs are getting much better at making decisions consistent with the criterion we set. But I would argue that the decisions themselves aren't always better or leading to a higher quality outcome. So a lot of us talk on the phone about garbage in, garbage out when it comes to predictive models. I think we also need to keep in mind that it's bias in, bias out. We need to think about what all we're putting into our models. So I want to give you a couple examples of what this looks like. And both of the images on the page here are examples of bias in AI systems. Might not be intuitive at first, but I think we're going to get there. So let's take the one on the left first. A lot of you might be familiar with Tay, otherwise known as the racist chatbot. And I'm not picking on Microsoft here. This was a huge experiment. And, by a lot of ways you can look at this, it can be looked at as a very successful experiment. The machine, the experiment of does the machine learn? It worked. So the point here was to see how this chatbot would interact on Twitter based on how real people tweet at and interact with it. Started out really well, neutral tweets, they were relevant to the way people were interacting, but the internet takes hold and other users were racist and sexist and just threw all kinds of stuff at Tay. And within hours, Tay was tweeting racist and sexist posts that it had learned from the interactions. So, this was a valuable experiment in saying Tay learned really fast. So the quick lesson here is no matter how smart your machine is, bias in, bias out. It'll learn fast. The example on the right, this football picture, this is going back to our recruiting and selection example from before. So, what we're looking at here is an example of an AI system that was looking for candidates with high potential for sales leadership. Upon some research, it was really clear that the algorithm was selecting candidates who had been high school quarterbacks for these sales leadership positions at a really high rate, much higher than any other ratios. And, similar to Tay, the algorithm worked. It did its job. It did what it was supposed to and found a relationship between people who had been successful in that role in the past and participation in high school football. Again, many of us on the phone will look at that and say, well, there's no relationship. It's not because, quarterback experience leads to sales performance. There's got to be some underlying variable. Is it goal orientation? Is it leadership? Is it the educational institution where they happen to play football? But if we had taken this on its face, we would continue to select these candidates and have a underrepresentation of female in sales leadership. Point here is that the algorithm is only as smart as the data we can give it. So, these systems really learn from the past. We know that the past involves a lot of conscious and unconscious bias and discrimination. So if we're asking the machine to learn from the past and past success, it's going to do that. But if we only use that data we've looked at in the past, we're only going to repeat that picture of past success that's not inclusive of everyone who could be successful. If we step back and say we're just going to let the machine do its job, it's AI, it's going to be more objective than us, we're abdicating responsibility, and in different ways we can allow that different systemic discrimination to continue. So a lot of our challenge in moving forward is going to be how do we include data that's not just where we've been, not just what we've looked at before and what kind of success we've had in the past, but how do we include data about where we're going, what's most important, and what differentiates us. So we'll start with some general implications about how we do that. I think I have all of your attention that there are dangers to this. This isn't to in any way slow down or, dissuade the direction of headed toward, using AI in your surveys, but to make more conscious decisions, the ones that are going to be aligned with our organizational goals, whether they're inclusion, diversity, or something else. We need to be a little bit more intentional. And the first more general implication that we've got here is knowing your bias. Talked about this. We're all human. We have biases. This isn't going to change. The key isn't to deny it or have it fly under the radar, but let's be really conscious and aware of where our biases are so that we can design systems that don't pass on our biases, but counteract them and check our biases by looking at different kinds of data. And I say this, it's really hard to do though. The Dunning effect shows that the more competent you are, the more aware you are of your own biases and potential shortcomings. So, a lot of people are going to be very able to do this. However, the other side of that Dunning effect is that the people who are least competent are least aware of their biases and may need additional kinds of support or other streams to make sure that we're including multiple sources. So some solutions here include, how do we use multiple data points? How do we involve others or document or trace decision-making patterns so that over time we can check for sources of bias and make sure we're including a variety of data points that will bring us a diversity of data possibilities. And this third point is one we're going to dive into more. Ultimately, we want to design systems that don't try to replicate our human decisions or don't try to just make things faster, but we want to look for ways that we can add value by having AI do what humans can't. We want to look for relationships or find relationships that we didn't know to search for. And in doing that, counteract our biases by going beyond what past success looks like. And part of that is including more data than what our hands-on systems can usually handle. AI is really valuable at taking those complex, really big data sets and drawing disparate relationships in a way that we just can't, or answering questions that we don't know how to ask. So, if we use these kinds of systems to search beyond our expected patterns, this is how we're going to use the technology to expand beyond our reach. I mentioned one way to do this is to include data not just about where we've been in past success, but where you're going. And that's in terms of your business goals. So how do you include things around your financial, your operational, or your values-based goals in order to include that? So for our models to be useful in guiding future decisions, we need to have some element of strategic direction so that we're getting closer to what's important. Okay. And that takes us to some more survey-specific kinds of advice. The first point I want to make here is matching your purpose to solution is really important. Right now, there are a lot of possibilities out there. They're all really exciting and offer so many kind of analytical opportunities. And the point here is to search for the product or the solution that best fits your needs. It might not be the first and shiniest product. So, going back to your purpose, and the purpose of your survey, what's going to give you the most insight to drive action from your survey? If the tool doesn't help you with that, even if you could do some really fun analysis, keep looking. There's going to be something else. The second point here is to maximize the use of your data, and again, to use AI to do what you can't. I was talking to a guy recently who was really excited about an AI system that helped him do drivers. But he said it wasn't working that great. He still had to go back and manually do some includes and excludes. And it begged the question of, then why are you using that system? Why don't you just run them by yourself? If you had 50 business units that needed drivers, might have made sense to use a mass sort of machine learning kind of system, but to do it for company overall and mess with it yourself made no sense. So my advice here is do the opposite. If there's something you do really well, it gives you good insight and it moves action forward and it works, then keep doing it. But look for the opportunities to integrate data sources in a way that are too complex or too time-consuming for you to do on your own. And often that is integrating different types of variables that normally would just be so time-consuming to code and set up the right analyses that it is better to feed it to a machine learning system and see what relationships you can start with and feed your analysis questions from there. And finally, related to that, it has to make sense. You can't just build models and hand them off. That works for customer clicks, but it doesn't work for how you act on employee data. A lot of times in our models, age comes up as a more potent predictor than tenure, but we edit it to include tenure because we can intelligently work from tenure and it's more meaningful. Different parts of the employee life cycle require different kinds of support. So that makes sense to work from and lead interventions from. Whereas, we don't want to act on age. That's not the right, move forward. So, these advice points aside, we're going to dive into a couple of examples of how we look at this in our survey practice. One example of how we use AI to solve some challenges is a product we call OV Voice. And this is for open text analysis. So the problem that a lot of survey practitioners are stuck with is they've got piles and piles of unstructured text data, and they want to make it meaningful and actionable. So our solution here is to help identify the comments that are most likely to be specific enough to drive action. It's not going to tell you what to do about the comment. It's not going to tell you who needs to see it, but it's going to say, based on your hundreds of thousands of comments, here are the 10 that have the most useful content that a top leader should read. And so, that's a really nice interplay between the AI of here's what's best, but you still need good common sense and a strong leader to know what to do with the data and interpret it. Another example is in action planning. So really common problem, managers get stuck on how to get started. And so you want to find a way to help them focus and prioritize, but the challenge here is also how do we keep them engaged in the process and make sure they're thinking through these action plans and not just selecting, something that's pre-generated for them. So what we do is we have a product called the Action Wizard that proactively reaches out to managers and says, hey, survey closed a couple weeks ago and you haven't gotten started on your action plan. Then when they come into the tool, it's going to guide them through the process of how to create a good, actionable, and most importantly, doable improvement plan. And throughout the life cycle, it's going to nudge them in different ways and keep them involved in the process and keep them moving. So another example of how to use the technology to make it smarter, but really blend the science with the art and the human touch. Last slide I want to leave you with is a checklist. So these are just some basic questions to ask yourself as you evaluate AI solutions. I think these are some good acid test questions that can help you differentiate, what are the value-added kinds of possibilities from what are the pitfalls or the shiny products that look really great but aren't going to add a ton of value. First question, what do I want the data to do? So this goes back to matching your purpose to the possibilities. Second thing I think everybody needs to ask themselves is, what does the machine do? How does it work? If you don't understand how it works, it's going to be really hard to get great insight and move forward. And the second part to that is, what happens to your data? A lot of AI providers will want to keep your data and use it in different ways to feed other things. And so you want to go into that with eyes wide open. The third question is, does that machine replicate a human process and just do it faster, or is it going to do something better? Is it going to add new kinds of insight and value? And then finally, how can the insight from that machine, how will that analysis inform practical human decisions? So, how is that fancy, shiny new product going to inform how you act on this data day to day? So, with that, we are just about at time here. So, the question I pose back out to all of you is how are you going to navigate the future of surveys? There are, a lot of possibilities. There are a lot of existing programs, and how do you bring it all together? So, we are a bit out of time. I don't think we're going to have time for questions live now, but if you have any, please do put them in the chat box. You will all get a post-webinar survey, so feel free to put them in there and I'll reach out to you, or feel free to send me an email down here. I'll also reach out to each of you with the slides, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation with any of you then.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. As usual, it was very interesting, and I think it unfortunately raises as many questions as it answers, right? But I do have one question. The speed of which AI is going to integrate itself into our HR systems, do you see that as quickening or leveling out? Where do you see that going in the next couple of years?
I think there's been a lot of movement in the last year or two as this has become really popular. I think that's going to continue in the next year or two. I think it's a really popular topic, and everyone wants to look into it. I think what the question will be is how different organizations decide to implement this and at what speed. It's an interesting piece that people want to move forward with, but it does raise questions of data privacy, how it'll get used, and that can often slow the actual implementation down.
Yep. Well, we are out of time, so thank you everybody for coming. Please do take a minute at the end of as you exit. There'll be a little survey that will pop up, and we'd love some feedback regarding the content, length, time of day, et cetera, that would help us continue to improve on the webinars that we offer. So with that, Victoria, any final words for everybody?
Just thank you all for coming, and I look forward to connecting with each one of you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.